Hi, old turkey neck back to continue my short story, The Eighth Dwarf. We're now into part 6. As you'll remember from part 5, Sleazy goes on a desperate attempt to find Snow White in Berlin and later the Netherlands without success, but we soon learn that she is actually hiding in an attic with a family in Amsterdam. And leaves her safe hiding place to go to the movies to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where she is spotted, recognized, denounced, and sent to Treblinka. So now we'll continue on with part 6 of The Eighth Dwarf. Walt was so wrapped up in his problems, he showed little interest in the war. By now, the world-famous Disney touch was considered cloying. Animals with long eyelashes, partaking in gentle woodland play, no longer appealed to the masses. Bugs Bunny, the wiseacre rabbit from Brooklyn, was more suited to their taste. To survive this bleak period, Walt went to work for the Army. Disney Studios began making films with titles like The Four Methods of Flush Riveting. Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales. Before long, 3/4 of the studio revenue was coming from Uncle Sam. Government training films may have kept Disney afloat, but Walt lost the one thing he cared most about: creative control. The work was not only uninspired, government functionaries nickel and dimed him to death. When the war finally ended, the studio was so broke, Walt had to borrow money from RKO. RKO! Can you imagine? We just missed working for Howard Hughes. The only picture Walt showed any interest in during this period was Song of the South. He called it his Negro picture. Based on the Uncle Remus stories, it was blatantly racist even then. It just goes to show how much Walt had lost the Disney touch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As bad as the war years were, December 7th, 1941 through August 15th, 1945, nothing topped 1941. That was the year Disney Studios went under. As I've said, Walt could be ruthless when he wanted, especially when he was facing bankruptcy. He thought nothing of firing people who'd outlived their usefulness. Weeding out the marginal, he called it. The truth is, Walt thought his employees were lucky to work for him. Those that didn't agree were called Bolsheviks. When Walt's secretary couldn't handle the pressure and had a nervous breakdown, he docked her pay. Did I mention she was also his sister-in-law? When one of his animators fainted from hunger because he couldn't afford a square meal, Walt couldn't have cared less. Walt may have wanted his animators to whistle while they worked, but that wasn't going to happen on $2 an hour. Bolsheviks or not, it was only a matter of time before some of the industry's most talented animators realized Walt's name on their check didn't put food on their table. When they finally understood he had no intention of paying them a living wage, they began to organize. The demands of the Screen Cartoonists Guild, or SCG, were reasonable enough. They wanted union recognition, reinstatement of those fired from union activity, and a fair and reasonable contract. Walt rejected their demands outright. In fact, he not only refused to negotiate, he wouldn't even recognize the SCG. They had no choice but to strike. Walt's response was to impose a studio lockout, but support for the strikers quickly grew. First, actors like John Garfield joined the picket lines. Then theater owners began boycotting Disney movies. When Technicolor stopped processing Disney films, Walt knew he was in trouble. The strike lasted 3 months, and because it was led by animators, they made the best-looking strike posters you've ever seen. One sign had Mickey Mouse declaring, "Are we mice or men?" Another showed Walt drawn as the big bad wolf trying to blow down a brick house filled with Disney employees. There was even a poster with Sleazy that read, "Snow White was really made by Walt's 700 dwarves." But things took an even more personal turn when the picketers showed up outside Walt's house. Walt always believed Disney Studios was one big happy family, but there was no ignoring the angry crowd on his front lawn that day. A temporary strike headquarters was set up on an empty lot across the street with a tent, a camp stove, and plenty of coffee and sandwiches to feed the strikers. Walking in circles in front of Walt's house, the protesters carried placards while chanting, "It's up to Walt to call a halt," and "Walt's the wolf at our door." Traffic backed up for miles. Walt had asked the Beverly Hills police to patrol his house, but when that proved insufficient, he hired 20 Pinkertons to keep the picketers at bay. Tensions were running high. Within the first few hours of the protest, someone knifed the tires on Walt's car. By noon, someone else had scratched his sedan with a screwdriver. Walt's lawyer, who nobody liked, including Walt, was burned in effigy. Shortly after that, someone threw a rock through Walt's bay window. The police tried keeping the strikers away, but Walt's Holmby Hills house sat close enough to the street that there wasn't much they could do. Walt could see what was going on. He'd spent most of the strike hidden behind the curtains of his living room's floor-to-ceiling windows. Occasionally he'd peek out, but that only made the crowd roar. It was close to 4 o'clock in the afternoon when a short man wearing a fedora emerged from the strike leader's tent and made his way to a sedan parked in front of Disney's house. He climbed under the hood of the car, then its roof, holding a megaphone in one hand while bouncing on the soles of his feet. The crowd began to cheer. Sleazy was back. "Walt Disney, you should be ashamed of yourself," Sleazy shouted, aiming the megaphone at the house. The crowd roared in appreciation. Sleazy had always been popular. Even when he was drinking himself to death, he maintained a coterie of loyal friends. When he got back on his feet, Disney's animators were only too happy to let him lead their insurrection. After all, who knew more about Walt's perfidy than Snow White's 8th dwarf? When Walt saw Sleazy whipping the crowd into a frenzy, he beckoned him to come inside. Sleazy hesitated for a moment, then asked the strikers if he should meet with Walt. When they signaled their approval, he climbed down from the car and headed for the front door. The house inside felt dark and empty. Lillian had left for Palm Springs to avoid all the fuss, taking their 2 daughters with her. Disney only had his dog to keep him company, which wasn't surprising, given her idea of a fair wage was 2 meals a day and a scratch behind the ear. Walt led Sleazy into the dining room, which had a vaulted ceiling painted the same light green color as the huge wooden beams that spanned its width. Walt invited Sleazy to sit on one of the 2 matching sofas, but since Sleazy's feet would barely have reached the edge of the cushion, he chose an ottoman instead. In the meantime, Walt offered him a drink, which Sleazy declined, then made one for himself. "Come on, Sleazy, what's this really about?" "It's about a fair wage for your animators, Walt." "No, it's not. It's personal." "Sure, it's personal. It's about you gypping your employees." Walt swirled the ice in his drink before taking a sip. "I've always believed in cartoons, Sleazy. They're one of the greatest entertainment mediums ever created. But if Disney Studios closes tomorrow, the quality of cartoons will drop precipitously, not to mention a lot of people will be out of work. Do you want to be the person who causes that to happen?" "That would be you, Walt, not me." "You people are lucky to have a job," Walt said angrily. "You're confused, Walt. It's the other way around." "Come on, Sleazy. This has nothing to do with a fair wage. It's about Snow White." Walt was right. Sleazy hadn't created the unhappiness at Disney Studios, but he was exploiting it to get revenge for Walt having Snowy deported. I don't know where she is, Sleazy. There's a war going on, in case you haven't heard. Very little information gets out. If you don't help me get her back, Walt, we will close you down. No, you won't, Sleazy. I'll close the studio myself before handing it over to a bunch of Reds. Don't be stupid. We'll make a dust bowl of this place. Everything you've worked for will be gone. Walt finished his drink. I'll bury you first, you little son of a bitch. Already ugly, the situation got worse once the strikers saw Sleazy's expression as he exited Walt's house. Fistfights broke out, then shots were fired. Before the end of the day, most of the strikers, including Sleazy, were in jail. Walt was so pissed, he briefly considered hiring a Chicago hoodlum named Willie Beoff to break the strike. Finally, the National Labor Relations Board couldn't ignore what was happening any longer and appointed a federal mediator to broker a deal. There wasn't much Walt could do once the feds stepped in. The mediator listened to both parties as part of an impartial hearing, then ruled in favor of the SCG. Animator wages were doubled overnight. Walt tried prettying up the picture, but there was no mistaking the result. He'd lost. Bank of America took over the studio shortly after that. The first thing they did was cancel all feature film production. The strike made Walt so bitter, he vamoosed to South America on a 10-week State Department-sponsored goodwill tour, but not before leaving instructions on who should be fired while he was gone. As things turned out, Sleazy wasn't the only one who could hold a grudge. Okay, that's the end of part 6. Stay tuned for part 7. Thanks so much for listening.